Happy Friday and welcome back to BrainScratch. I'm John Lordan. This week, guys, I have been throwing myself into all kinds of information trying to pull this story together for you. It's a big one. We are diving into a case that was initially classified as a hit and run. But due to one of the largest true crime courtroom media circuses that we've had in recent memory, now a mother has a chance at finding justice for her son. If there wasn't enough for the public to process during the Alec Murdaugh trial, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Department, or SLED, found something that is now leading them into another death investigation that has the name Murdaugh's all over it and may drastically change the understanding and public perception of what happened to a young man named Stephen Smith out on a country road almost 8 years ago. In what might be the briefest entry I've ever seen on Wikipedia, it details that Crocketville is an unincorporated community in Hampton County, South Carolina, United States. The community is located on U.S. Route 601, 3.7 miles northeast of Hampton, in what's known as the Low Country. Now, the Low Country is a region that includes significant salt marshes and other coastal waterways, making it an important source of biodiversity in South Carolina. The Low Country today is also known for its historic cities and communities, natural environment, cultural heritage, and tourism industry. Of course, it's now also known because of one of the biggest cases to grab the attention of the true crime community all over the world. But before the murders of Maggie and Paul, there was another tragic death in this area. Stephen Smith was a 19-year-old student at Orangeburg Calhoun Technical College who had dreams in high school of becoming a doctor. He was attending classes, working towards a parallel dream. He was working on becoming a nurse. He's described by neighbors as a sweet person who looked out for others. He was known as a jokester, and I'd also say he was probably someone very proud and very brave. Stephen grew up as an openly gay teen in rural South Carolina. His mother, Sandy Smith, says that he was often bullied, but he never let that stop him from being himself. He would often say to his mother, "God doesn't make mistakes. I am who I am, and God did not make a mistake." His mother, Sandy, said he was a wonderful, amazing son. He was very intelligent, spontaneous. He was my world. He loved books, he loved school, and he loved his family. In the early morning hours of July 8th, 2015, a tow truck driver who was heading into work saw something in the middle of Sandy Run Road in Crocketville at approximately 4 a.m. He called 911 and reported, "I was just driving down Crocketville Road and I see somebody lying out. He's laying in the road. I ain't moved him or nothing like that, but somebody's going to hit him. It's dark." Lying right in the middle of the road, literally on the painted lines, was the body of Stephen Smith. Investigators believed Smith was on his way from a class when he ran out of gas about 5 miles from his home. His car was found about 3 miles away from where his body was on nearby U.S. Route 601. It was parked off of the road, some of his textbooks still sitting in the back of his car. The gas cap was also off. The theory was that he was walking to find gas in the middle of the road when a vehicle came by and hit him and then took off. When Sandy Smith heard that theory, she knew immediately that Stephen would not do that. He was what she described as skittish, and if he had to leave the safety of his car, she insisted that he would have walked through the woods. She has a good reason to believe that, since it actually happened once before. Quote, "He called his sister one night. He ran out of gas, and he hid in the woods and would not come out until he was sure that it was her. We know for a fact it was not a hit and run. Stephen would not have been in the roadway." According to the coroner, their analysis led them to the conclusion that Stephen died of blunt force trauma to the head, most likely from a mirror on a passing vehicle. They couldn't determine the make or model of the vehicle, and there was other serious problems with this conclusion. The first of those problems being noted by one of the responding officers on the scene. Quote, "When I got up on the scene, I noticed a young white male lying in the roadway with severe head trauma. Nothing at the scene appeared that it was a vehicular accident. He had no abrasions, no torn clothes. The shoes were still on his feet, cell phone still in his pocket. The only injuries that I noticed were to his head." The autopsy report actually confirms this. There are no injuries to Stephen's body below his torso. Plus, it notes that he was well over 5 feet tall. For a mirror to have hit his head, it would have to have been a mirror from a car and he was bent over in the roadway, or possibly a truck when he was standing up. To me, there's also the question of where his body was found. Considering there were no abrasions, no torn clothes, his body likely didn't travel far after this supposed impact. If you see someone standing literally on the line in the center of the road, isn't there a good chance that you'd be able to avoid hitting them? Particularly in a part of the country where you have to deal with wildlife running into the road pretty consistently? Stephen's keys and cell phone were indeed still in his pocket. Shouldn't the impact have knocked those items out? His mother also details that he wore his shoes with his laces stuffed into the shoe. He didn't tie his laces. They were typically worn very loose, and those loose shoes were still on his feet. It's fairly common that you'd hear about people's shoes flying off during a collision with a vehicle. Highway Patrol found no skid marks, no vehicle debris, and no broken glass. Anyone who's had an accident of this nature or even hit a large animal like a deer knows that it can severely damage your car. How is there no debris at all? Multiple agencies were investigating the case, including the Highway Patrol and their multidisciplinary accident investigation team called MATE. Highway Patrol Trooper Lieutenant Thomas Moore questioned it right from the start. Quote, "I definitely think he was murdered. He was murdered there or murdered elsewhere and dropped there." He even took his issues up his chain of command, but for some reason, he kept meeting pushback. "I felt like the brass, which would be the people running Highway Patrol, should have stood up to SLED and said, 'This is not a hit and run. Y'all are asking us to investigate something that is not a hit and run.'" He even tried to escalate it to the Hampton County Sheriff's Office, and he tried to hand them the case file. Line by line, I explained to them this was not a hit and run and tried to hand them the file, and they would physically not take it with their hands, he said. And Trooper Moore wasn't the only one that thought this. Quote, "I saw no vehicle debris, skid marks, or injuries consistent with someone being struck by a vehicle," stated Trooper D.B. Rowell in his report. "We see no evidence to suggest the victim was struck by a vehicle." A third narrative written by a MATE officer who is not named stated that after initially being advised of a possible hit-and-run fatality, he arrived on the scene, and there he ran into the Hampton County Coroner, Ernie Washington. Ernie Washington told him that this was actually a homicide. His report read, "He pointed out the wound to be a gunshot wound and showed me the entry point. Assistant Coroner Kelly Green then began to show me photographs they took, again pointing to the entry point to the head and also a defensive wound to the hand. I asked for clarity if they were sure it was a homicide, and their response was yes." Other notes from the scene are similarly clear. James B. Talon III wrote, "After further investigation, it was believed the victim had been shot in the head. An EMS worker stated that a projectile wound was located on the victim's head. A hole in the skull was located above the victim's right eye. For something that looks very straightforward to so many people on the scene, things take a very strange turn during the medical examination. Dr. Erin Presnell concluded that Stephen had actually died of severe blunt force trauma. She claims there was no projectile, no bullet was found, no fragments of a bullet were found. She says that he died from being struck by a motor vehicle." Trooper Moore actually contacted her directly asking why she ruled it as a motor vehicle accident, and she responded to him, quote, She told me it was not her job to figure that out. It was mine. The autopsy report is available online, and it does note that most of the damage is to the right side of his head, above his right eye. His right shoulder was also dislocated, and there were some marks noted on his left hand. Stephen's mother, Sandy, had to deal with theories bouncing back and forth like a tennis ball. Quote, they said he was shot in the head. Then it turns out it was a hit and run. And then he was beat up. So the story just kept changing over and over. The Highway Patrol also did something that they never do in death investigations related to traffic collisions. They ordered a sexual assault kit to be processed on Stephen. Now, I've seen several experts weigh in on this, trying to figure out why that would have been ordered, but to me it seems kind of simple. They thought that it was a murder, and they were trying to find or rule out a common motive. However, it seems that that kit was never processed, and as of today, it actually seems that there's some question as to what happened to that kit at this point. Sandy is very clear in her thoughts. She says that she thinks he was murdered and says, quote, I do think it's because he was gay. I said that from the beginning. It was a hate crime. The looking for gas story also has some big question marks for me. His wallet was actually left in the car. Now, how are you going to buy gas without your wallet? Why was the gas cap off? If you had no gas, you would have known it from the gauge. Why would you take the gas cap off if you don't actually have gas? I can't figure anything in my mind. There's no helpful information you can get. I think I'm out of gas. I'm opening it up. I'm looking, like you can't even see in. Most of them have a little flip cover on it. And even if you take a pencil or something and push it, you're looking at a tube. You have no way to check your gas level with that cap off. Why was that cap off? It feels like it's to tell a story. Now, admittedly, if you were maybe looking for help, hoping that someone driving by might stop and be able to help you, maybe you do that to give them a sign of, oh, you know, I'm out of gas. But the way that his car is angled and the side that the gas cap is on, you can't see it from the road. Not to mention the location of where his car is really far off the road. Not quite to where I'd say it's hidden, but it's certainly out of view. I think you could probably drive down the road and you might not necessarily catch it until you were driving right by it. It's interesting to me. Does that speak to his personality? Like that quote his mother gave about him being skittish and trying to cling to the woods for safety, perhaps. But the gas cap thing and leaving the wallet, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It actually has me wondering if someone came up on Stephen at the car and maybe initially offered to help, and then it turned into an attack. Like, yeah, I'll get you some gas. They go back to the car. They come back with some other object, and it turns into a physical assault, something along those lines. And there actually might be some more information to support that line of thinking. Mark Burkhart says that he was dating Stephen. He also says that they spoke at 3:30 a.m. that morning and, quote, I asked him on one of the calls, are you walking? Because he told me he was running out of gas. I says, are you walking? Because I hear cars going by. And his answer to me was no. And then the call dropped. Mark also told investigators that Stephen mentioned that he thought he was being followed, and Mark thought he could hear big mud tires approaching before the call dropped. Like they're coming toward him or going past because they sounded loud and they were getting louder. And that, I believe, was the last time I talked to him, is what he said. So he hears vehicles to the point where he thinks he's walking. On top of that, he thinks he very specifically hears these kind of larger mud tires. Now, that also tells us that Stephen is able to place phone calls. He's able to text, but it is late at night. And is that why he didn't call his twin sister like he had done previously? I don't know. But there is something else. Several days later, after Stephen's funeral, Mark starts getting some harassing phone calls that say they're originating from the Cayman Islands. A police incident report notes, the calls inform the victim that he would die the same way Smith did, and the victim believes that Smith's death was a homicide. Now I know where there's smoke, there's fire, but here, it's like we can see the flames, but we have this medical examiner's analysis that's basically keeping this case with the wrong department. Because it's looking like a vehicular accident, it's staying with the Highway Patrol, and they're saying this isn't the case for us. We got to get this back to SLED. We got to get this to the sheriff. Someone else needs to process this crime scene. It just seems like everyone outside of the Highway Patrol are turning a blind eye to the situation. Why? The spot that Stephen was found in was also less than 10 miles from Moselle, the Murdoch's family 1,700-acre hunting property. The same place where Alec Murdaugh would later gun down his wife and son. The Murdochs are prominent figures in this area. There are numerous stories of them using their power and influence to control the outcomes in numerous situations and being connected to other people in powerful positions at many levels. Now, this all seems to come into play in Stephen's case very quickly. His mother said, quote, "The first call my family received after the murder was from authorities notifying us of Stephen's death. The second came very quickly the same morning from solicitor Randolph Murdaugh. In fact, he called my ex-husband's cell phone as we waited in the police station for a positive identification. He said he heard of the case and was interested in working pro bono as a liaison between the family and investigators. Stephen's father accepted the offer, although we were unsure why Mr. Murdaugh wanted to help us. We also weren't sure how he found out so quickly, even before it was confirmed to be our son. Surprisingly, just after a few interactions, Mr. Murdaugh stopped returning our calls." She also said that several Murdaugh family members were seen at the scene of the accident or crime later that morning when Stephen's body was being removed. And that's not the only connectivity. Documents show investigators are quickly fielding numerous tips about the Murdaugh family being related to this death. The first tip comes in early August, mentioning rumors of a relationship between Stephen Smith and Buster Murdaugh, the eldest and only surviving son. Indeed, Stephen Smith and Buster did know each other. They went to high school together, with Stephen also tutoring Buster, and they played on a baseball team together. Buster is known to have had a girlfriend at the time, but does that rule out a potential affair between the two? I don't think so. An anonymous tip would come in claiming that a man named Dontario Aiken, along with another black man and Murdaugh, are the ones involved in the death. Investigators followed up, and despite Dontario claiming that he knew Buster, but they weren't really friends and they didn't hang out, investigators would learn that they were at least found to be friends on Facebook. Yet another tip comes in, this one telling investigators that the tipster was asked to pass along the information at the request of former solicitor Randolph Buster Murdaugh, Buster's grandfather. Very soon, the Highway Patrol is fielding allegations from 10 out of 18 different sources suggesting that Buster should be questioned, and many alleging that he and Stephen were indeed in a relationship. Stephen's twin sister, Stephanie, told authorities that her brother had become very secretive about 2 weeks prior to the incident. It's also been said that Stephen could be very private about his relationships, and he might have had a number of men that he was dating. Stephen's father would die only 3 months after his son's death. They're buried in a family plot in Gooding Cemetery with Stephen's brother, who died as a baby. Sandy kept pushing, somehow, trying to find someone to help her with the case. She was concerned that there was no real investigation happening, and the Highway Patrol wasn't the right organization to lead this. She wrote a letter detailing her concerns to the FBI just over a year after Stephen's death. Quote, "Stephen had on more than one occasion mentioned to friends and his twin sister that he was involved romantically with someone from a prominent family in the county who was hiding his sexuality. He said it would shock people to know this person was gay. We suspect this could be the young man Stephen was referring to, though he never named him." She also told the FBI that an unnamed witness told a member of her family that he was present when Stephen was murdered, and that killer was Buster Murdaugh. According to this witness, Buster allegedly beat Stephen to death with a baseball bat because Stephen was gay. Quote, "The witness said they were out smashing mailboxes when they came upon Stephen, and Buster seized the opportunity. The young man said that Buster threatened to kill him if he ever spoke up. This information was given to investigators, but nothing has come of it. It has been apparent from the first week of this investigation that authorities are covering up critical evidence, and we no longer know who to trust. This investigation is being deliberately derailed." Unfortunately, it looked like Sandy was not going to get any help from law enforcement. The years started passing. But then, several more tragic deaths and a certain trial and conviction later, all of a sudden, SLED announces something that no one expected. They are investigating the death of Stephen Smith based on something they found during the Alec Murdaugh investigation. What did they find to turn this around? Or was it just a matter of waiting for the power of Alec Murdaugh to be contained behind prison walls? Dr. Kenny Kinsey, state reconstruction expert who actually gave testimony on blood spatter and bullet trajectory in the Alec Murdaugh trial, is now working the investigation for the Smith family's legal team. He says, "The publicity from the Murdaugh trial helped to get people paying attention to Stephen's case again. We're going to consider everything, and we're going to look into as much as we can look into. If somebody heard something or knows something, we're asking them to please come forward." He notes several distinct possibilities. Number one, that Stephen was hit with a vehicle and the driver actually knew it. Number two, that Stephen could have been hit by a vehicle and the driver might not have realized it, possibly thought it was an animal, something else like that. Number three, that Stephen was hit by something hanging outside of a vehicle. To me, it sounds like he's talking about the possibility of the baseball bat and maybe referring to the story of them bashing mailboxes that night. Number four, that Stephen was harmed somewhere else and then placed there. And if that's true, where is the crime scene? Is the crime scene potentially back at his car? I don't know. The location of the wallet, the gas cap, it just really seems off to me, but I'm not finding any type of notes about blood being found at that location or anything really suspicious being found at that location outside of these conditions of the car that I'm mentioning. Or was the crime committed somewhere else? Someone moved Stephen, but then they also have to move his vehicle. Maybe there's some potential for DNA inside the vehicle. If all this wasn't enough, some recent news reports are saying that two men who were actually teenagers back at that time are now also being considered as persons of interest in the current investigation. Patrick Austin Wilson and Sean Conley lived a few miles from where Stephen's body was found. Patrick Wilson has former charges for attempted murder, but those charges were dropped by a prosecutor that is said to be connected to the Murdaughs. Conley has a history of all kinds of charges, DUIs, domestic violence. But are these potentially fall guys? Or is there a chance that they could have been with Buster on that night and these stories all somehow tie together? Well, there's a potential snag on that theory as well. Steve Peterson, former investigative consultant for the Smith family, told Court TV that SLED relayed to him that both Buster and Paul were not in the county on the night that this happened. Now, is that accurate information, or is that part of what seems like a big smokescreen that's all around this case? I have to wonder about it, because after you have two documentaries, you've got Netflix and HBO reporting on the potential affair between Buster and Stephen, I would think if Buster had proof like this, that there would have been some kind of lawsuit, or at a minimum, that proof would have been released publicly. In his only comment so far about Stephen's case, Buster has said, quote, "I have tried my best to ignore the vicious rumors about my involvement in Stephen Smith's tragic death that continue to be published in the media as I grieve over the brutal murders of my mother and brother. I love them so much and miss them terribly. I haven't spoken up until now because I want to live in private while I cope with their deaths and my father's incarceration. Before, during, and since my father's trial, I have been targeted and harassed by the media and followers of this story. This has gone on far too long. These baseless rumors of my involvement with Stephen and his death are false. I unequivocally deny any involvement in his death, and my heart goes out to the Smith family. I'm requesting that the media immediately stop publishing these defamatory comments and rumors about me. From my perspective, it would be really easy to make all those rumors go away if you could provide proof that on that tragic night, you weren't there. You were somewhere else. So it just makes me somewhat skeptical about that proof actually existing. Other than Buster speaking out, no other members of his family have been interviewed about Stephen's case. It's said that the Murdaugh name appears in the case files at least 40 times. Now, with the tide turning for Sandy, she makes a very tough decision, and she asks for some help to do it. In March of 2023, a GoFundMe was started. Quote, "We feel it's critical to seek a new goal, an independent exhumation and autopsy, and we're launching Justice for Stephen and Smith with that immediate goal in mind. While the state can elect and fund an exhumation and new autopsy, it is our understanding that it would be carried out at MUSC, where his death was initially classified as hit and run, despite no evidence to support it. We need a new, unbiased look at his body and an accurate determination of his cause of death based on facts. It's a huge expense, but we're hoping that with your support, we can make this happen and finally get the answers we need." Well, within just a few weeks, what an amazing community this is, the family announced they had enough money. And on March 31st of 2023, Stephen's body was exhumed. A pathologist that worked on this with the family, her name is Dr. Michelle Dupree, notes, "The body in something like this is a crime scene, and we can gather so much information from that." A team of 6 worked for 6 hours on the independent autopsy. They say that they consider the autopsy a success. Dr. Dupree says that she's confident this will bring answers to the Smith family. Quote, "I can actually tell you that we were able to get all the information, really, that we need. We were able to do a complete and thorough second autopsy. Everything that has been done, and everyone who has taken care of Stephen from day one till he was returned back to the grave, did a very professional job." Stephen's body was returned to its final resting place on April 2nd. Sandy Smith updated everyone on the GoFundMe. She said, quote, "Our family is so very grateful to all of you who came together to help us in our fight for justice for Stephen. Thank you for not allowing Stephen's story to be swept under a rug. This is Stephen's year." Bland Richter Law Firm will represent Sandy Smith. They said in a statement, "What we're really trying to do is give a mother answers. Hit and run? We don't think so. Injustice hides in the shadows. Justice seeks the daylight. A new dawn is rising on the Stephen Smith case. This is not Alec Murdaugh 2.0 or any Murdaugh 2.0. This is the Stephen Smith 2.0. It's all about Stephen." And in late March, another twist would be announced by SLED. Quote, "The Stephen Smith case is being investigated as a homicide," said Ryan Alphin, executive director with SLED. "I've been waiting on this news for almost 8 years," said Stephen's mother, Sandy. "I'm in shock. I'm elated. I'm waiting for the next chapter." SLED is also reportedly keeping open communication going with the Bland Richter Law Firm. And in another unbelievable twist, they actually told the law firm that they didn't feel like they needed the second autopsy to prove that this was homicide. So are they just plainly discounting Dr. Presnell's analysis, or did they find some piece of physical evidence during the Murdaugh investigation? Independent reporter Will Folks, who previously served as press secretary to the governor of South Carolina, wrote on fitsnews.com that contrary to popular perception, SLED's investigation into Stephen Smith's death was not based on any evidence or information obtained at Moselle, but rather the agency receiving a copy of the original 2015 Highway Patrol accident report. People.com also seems to support that, stating that on June 23rd, 2021, agents from SLED received information about his death and subsequently reviewed the case file, and it was apparent that the Highway Patrol didn't believe Mr. Smith's death was a hit and run by motor vehicle. Regardless of why, we now have an active homicide investigation trying to find justice for Stephen Smith, and several pieces of physical evidence that could be looked into further. Some reports I looked into mention blue paint chips that were found on his clothing. Do those match any vehicles of interest, possibly? Can they be run in the Justice Department's paint data query database to at least drill down to a possible make and model? What about the cell phone? In her letter to the FBI, Sandy was concerned that the cell phone just wasn't being processed. She knew that it was locked, and she kept checking to see if investigators had sent it to Apple to get it unlocked, and they hadn't, time and time again. Well, we now have confirmation from her legal team. Attorney Richter said that cell phone is unlocked, and it's currently in the hands of SLED. He also said that he thinks that that cell phone is a really big deal in this case. It was on Stephen. His partner, Attorney Bland, reports that SLED also has a tablet that Stephen owns, and they're working on cracking that. Could a digital footprint help crack this case wide open? I certainly think it's a strong possibility. Here's another quote from Attorney Bland. I think the case will be solved by phone evidence or computer evidence, both before and after the killing. Now, just to be perfectly blunt and clear, Buster Murdaugh has never been named a suspect or a person of interest in this case. Eric Bland said that cops do believe there are a handful of witnesses who know what happened. Bland is hoping that those people could now speak without fear following the Murdaugh conviction, but Bland is also clear about something else. Quote, as we sit here today, Buster is a victim. He lost a mother, a brother, and now his father's in jail. Buster, as far as we know, has nothing to do with this. I think it was a hate crime. Stephen was a courageous young man to live an openly gay lifestyle in the low country of the South in 2015. Anyone with information about Stephen Smith's death can call the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division at 803-737-9000, or they can call the Bland Richter Law Firm directly at 843-573-9900. Now, the GoFundMe for this case has blown up, raising well over its intended target, but I still want you to consider donating to it. Sandy Smith said that she would like to start a scholarship in her son's name with any money that's left over from the fund. She says that he always talked about how expensive those textbooks for school were. So on behalf of our supporters here at the channel, we're making a donation, and I hope that that donation helps to bring justice for Stephen and his family, but maybe also some opportunities for other students who are pursuing their dreams in medicine. Thank you, People.com, Live 5 News, ABC 7, WYFF4.com, Newsweek, News Nation Now, The Daily Mail, FitzNews.com, LawandCrime.com, The Sun, WSAV, Fox News, The New York Post, GreenvilleOnline.com, RadarOnline.com, and, of course, Wikipedia for information contributing to today's story. I'd also like to thank new patrons Karen and Melissa Ridner. Since 2015, we've always run limited commercial ads for the benefit of the viewers and the families we're trying to help. Obviously, we can't do that without support. If you'd like to help us out, please visit LordanArts.com. There you can sign up for Patreon, sign up for PayPal, buy merchandise, or even just buy us a coffee like Mike W. recently did. We really appreciate your support on our mission to run as few ads as possible and help as many cases as we can. Please join us again soon, right here on the LordanArts channel.